Okay, let's jump right in on my menopausal metabolic makeover. First, I want to explain a little bit about what I even mean by a metabolic makeover. When we hear the word metabolism, you're probably thinking about how quickly you burn fat or how effective you lose weight. I've been complaining for years that there's something wrong with my metabolism. I want to spend just a few moments clarifying what I mean by metabolic health or metabolism. Now, when I started this year, I had been through 2 or 3 years of some really significant life changes, and I had gathered a few extra pounds that I was just really struggling to get off. I would get them off and they would come back on. I would get them off and they would come back on. And note that knowledge is not the problem here. I've actually passed advanced exams on eating well, moving more, sleeping well, and the power of these things to help me regulate my body weight and my metabolic health. And I just couldn't figure out what was going on. So let's first cover a few definitions. When I say metabolism or metabolic health, what I'm referring to is my body's ability to handle the fuel that I eat, turn it into energy, store extra energy or burn extra energy, and then energize my body to actually move around and access that energy to provide for my everyday needs. That whole process is tightly regulated by hormones and our genetics and is powerfully affected by our lifestyle habits. So there's a powerful genetic component, but I want to encourage you that our genes can be regulated by our lifestyle habits, and a family history is not always a sentence that we're going to have the same diagnoses that our family had. Why should we even care about our metabolic health, especially if we perceive that we are at a weight that we feel good in or we like the way our clothes fit? The reason that it's incredibly important is that your body's handling of the fuel that you eat and how it stores it and burns it and turns it into energy for you to execute during the day is very predictive of future disease. So having metabolic health that is not where it should be is a risk factor for type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease like heart attack or stroke, Alzheimer's, fatty liver, and all of those just lead to more bad things that we don't want, right? I don't want. So what are some of the risk factors for having bad metabolic health, which is also called metabolic syndrome? Here are a few markers, and most of them you can measure yourself, or your doctor probably has measured them with your annual lab work. First is blood pressure. Now, you may be wondering, what does my blood pressure have to do with my blood glucose? It's all related. Having a blood pressure of greater than 130 over 90 is a risk factor and a component of an unhealthy metabolism. Number 2, waist circumference. Having a body type that tends to store extra energy around the waist is a risk factor for metabolic disease. Number 3, triglycerides. Your doctor will measure this on your lipid panel or your cholesterol profile, and this is one measure or marker of how well your body handles the fats and other foods that you eat. A level greater than 150 is considered metabolically at risk. You want your level to be less than 50, and actually, personally, I'm always going for double digits when it comes to my triglycerides. Next is your HDL, or many people call it the good cholesterol. Science is really still evolving about this, but there does appear to be a correlation between HDL cholesterol above 50 in women and protection from heart disease and other metabolic disorders. Next is your fasting plasma glucose. This is your glucose when you first wake up in the morning or anytime you've gone 8 to 12 hours without eating. And normally it should be less than 100. Now, your doctor may choose to also run some additional tests that might be important in many conditions, like they might check your thyroid, they might check your vitamin D levels. We know that having adequate vitamin D stores can be important in regulating our metabolic health. And if you're perimenopausal or postmenopausal, your doctor might check hormone levels. All right, so what happened was, I'm trotting around for 3 years through some major life changes with some extra weight that I was getting on, getting off, couldn't keep it off. And then I get lab work done and I get a few values that were quite shocking to me. Although they were not in the abnormal range, they weren't like pristine. And I want pristine labs. These were high normal. And the ones that particularly concerned me were my hemoglobin A1C, which is a long-term measure of how well my glucose is regulated, and my LDL or bad cholesterol. They were both normal, but they were in the high normal range. So I embarked on what's now turned out to be 9 months, but I don't see it ending anytime soon because I continue to learn and evolve and tweak of a menopause metabolic makeover. Going to guide you through the steps that I took. You ready? Let's go. Number one, the very first thing I did was stop focusing on the scale. The first thing I did was get out of my head about the scale. I began to focus, maybe I was a little obsessed on my insulin receptors and how healthy they were. Now, coming up soon, I'm going to post my diabetes and insulin receptor masterclass. So watch for that. It was a relief to stop focusing on the scale and focus on some other markers like my fasting glucose in the morning, my hemoglobin A1C, and really digging in to learn more about everything I could do in my lifestyle to make my insulin receptors work better. Now, again, my values were in the normal range, but I was really concerned about the trajectory that my lab work might be taking. And I was also a little bit frustrated and concerned about the extra pounds that I just couldn't get off because I knew that these extra pounds did put me at risk for insulin resistance and possibly future disease. All right. So after I changed my mindset, decided not to focus on the scale for a while, I got busy building some muscle. The next thing I did was commit to a resistance training program. Now, I have been lifting on and off for most of my life, for years, but I had gotten a little bit plateaued and not so excited about really focusing on building strength. I needed something new. So I joined an 8-week challenge earlier in 2024, and I really focused on consistency. By joining a challenge written by a well-known and widely respected fitness instructor, I outsourced all of the cognitive load. I didn't have to think about what I was going to do. I just had to show up and do it. Now, whether or not I went to the gym or worked out at home is in a future episode, but I will tell you a teaser. I figured out that driving to the gym consistently was really a struggle for me, and I shifted my whole mojo to work out at home. I'll cover that in a future episode. Now, I know you may have heard before that you're supposed to resistance train, you're supposed to lift weights. What I want to stress to you is not just that we know we're supposed to do it. I want to help you learn to figure out, how do I get myself to do it? Because that's really the challenge, right? You don't need me to tell you that it's good for you to lift some weights and grow some muscle. But let me take this opportunity to remind you that after age 40, our muscle mass decreases every year. And muscle improves insulin sensitivity, decreases your fall risk, improves your bone health, gives you a smoking hot metabolism so that you can eat the things you want, burn energy more efficiently. It increases your sleep. It increases your energy. There's really endless reasons that we should all be lifting. But I want to point out that it's not that I have spectacular willpower that I was able to do this. I made it reasonable for myself, and I made it easier for myself by joining a group which had a community for accountability and getting guidance from a professional. Okay, what were my benefits here? They are endless. Immediately, I had increased strength, increased energy. I felt great in my body again, even before losing weight. I also knew that increasing my muscle mass might cause some increase on the scale in the short term, but I just decided I didn't care. I was going for strength and building muscle mass. Moving on to the third thing I did. The third thing I did was revisit some experimentation with intermittent fasting. Now, I had had a very rocky past with intermittent fasting. I pretty much flopped. I had done some multi-day fasting mimicking. I had tried a 2 or 3 day water fast on my own, and I just flopped on all of it. I hated it. It made me feel crazy in my head. Maybe I wasn't in the right headspace at the time, but that was really the only kind of fasting I had tried. This time, I decided to revisit time-restricted feeding for 2 main outcomes. One, the fact that there is good evidence that time-restricted feeding can increase insulin sensitivity. And remember, I'm thinking about my insulin receptors here. But also, time-restricted feeding or skipping a meal can simply be a way to help yourself eat the right amount of calories. Here's one thing I learned about myself, and there is evidence to back this up. The more times I bellied up to a plate, the more likely I was to eat beyond the actual energy that I really needed. So I decided to just be open-minded and experiment. How would I handle skipping breakfast? If I just put myself in front of a plate fewer times a day, would I consume less calories or would I compensate, which is what many people actually say they do? So I started skipping breakfast, and when I was very, very hungry, I ate. I didn't make it extremely hard on myself, but I realized in a very short time that I actually felt completely fine if I did not have breakfast, and I really did not get hungry at all. Now, eating less times per day did mean that I had to be a little more diligent, focusing on my nutrition. I really knew that I needed to get enough protein since I was trying to lift some heavy weights. I'm always making sure that I'm getting enough fiber. I knew that I needed to get enough servings of fruits and vegetables every day and a serving of beans, so I was more aware of my nutrition. Now, I do eat mostly a plant-based diet, and I have a video and podcast episode about that. You can catch it on the podcast or on my YouTube channel. That said, I actually did not track anything or count calories or macros. If I did get hungry in the morning, I would have a small protein and fiber-rich breakfast, but I made sure this was not an overly restrictive mental or physical activity. There were some interesting side effects. One was that I did limit my calories and put myself into apparently a very mild calorie deficit because what I experienced was gradual and sustained weight loss while feeling like I really wasn't trying that hard. The second thing was that it did seem to help me regulate and be more aware of my true hunger and fullness cues. I did find that this time I didn't overcompensate during the hours that I was eating. Now, intermittent fasting is not appropriate for everyone. If you've got a history of an eating disorder or you have any concerns at all about your medical conditions, the medications that you take in the morning or at later times during the day, you must discuss all of this with your healthcare provider. So that wraps up the first 3 steps of my Menopause Metabolic Makeover. Focus not on the scale, but on my actual metabolic markers and think about my insulin receptors a whole lot more. Committed to a resistance training program and showed up even when it was messy or I didn't complete it perfectly or it felt like a bad day. And 3, started skipping breakfast and experimenting with intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding to control my energy intake. Thanks for tuning in. See you soon for part 2.